Sorry. Sure, I think so.
No, so I just want your water glass to go here so it doesn't.
Wonderful, thanks. All right. Thank you all for being here today. And a special thank you to our members of Parliament who have joined us, Craig Scott, David Christofferson, and Alexandrine Latendresse from the NDP, Stéphane Dion and Scott Sims, and Frank Vallieret from the Liberal Party, as well as the leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May. We did invite Pierre Poilievre from the Conservative Party, but unfortunately we did not hear a response. My name is Adam Shedletzky. I'm a co-founder of Leadnow.ca. Leadnow launched before the 2011 federal election and has since grown to include over 330,000 Canadians. Our mission is to help people across Canada deepen our democracy to create a more open, just, and fair society. Our priorities for campaigning and action are driven by our members' priorities, and we are not affiliated with any political party. We are here today because Canadians across the country, including over 50,000 who signed this petition over the past several weeks, want to be able to participate in creating a new elections law that will impact our fundamental democratic rights. They are outraged that the long-awaited Fair Elections Act, introduced without any consultation with opposition parties or Canadians or Elections Canada, does little to combat real election fraud and instead suppresses the vote of marginalized groups. Let me briefly explain. Following the proven election fraud that happened in a 2011 election, our election watchdog requests that Parliament provide it with the power to compel witness testimony during an investigation, just like the Competitions Bureau can. This was partially because political operatives refused to testify, making it much harder for Elections Canada to get to the bottom of things. Yet this Elections Act does not give them this power, nor does it provide penalties for political parties whose databases are used for unauthorized purposes. The robocall registry and new penalties for impersonating elections officials does not adequately incentivize political parties to protect their databases, nor will they assist Elections Canada in adequately investigating and catching the perpetrators of voter fraud. Minister Poilievre does not appear to have any answers for why our elections watchdog was not provided with the single most important power that they requested. Instead, despite a complete lack of evidence that any actual fraud has occurred with the vouching process that 120,000 Canadians used to vote in 2011, or the use of voter ID cards, the Conservatives have decided to make it harder for Canadians to vote. This effort to increase the complexity of voting requirements is eerily similar to what we've seen happening in the United States over the past decade, where dozens of bills have been introduced, and they've had the documented effect of reducing voter turnout by millions of voters. Minister Poilievre points to the Neufeld report for evidence that voter fraud needs to be tackled in Canada. Yet this report does not present one iota of evidence that there was even one case of fraud. Moreover, it makes no recommendation whatsoever to eliminate vouching or the use of voter ID cards. Rather, the report's first recommendation is to widen the use of voter ID cards as a valid piece of address identification, because it proved to be very popular in a pilot program in 2011 where 900,000 Canadians participated, and between 36 and 73% of the target communities, which were students, Aboriginal groups, and Aboriginal people, as well as seniors, used voter ID cards when they could, because it's intuitive and it makes sense. If you think about students have a student card and they move frequently, so it's not easy to show proof of address. Whereas if they can show their student card and their voter ID card, it's very easy, it's intuitive, it's simple. So people use it. The crisis in Canadian democracy is a lack of voter turnout and crisis of confidence in our electoral system, not fraud by individual voters. It not only does this bill actively suppress the vote, it also appears to prevent Elections Canada from educating our youth on democracy or conducting innovative experiments to increase voter turnout. The reality is that with many Canadians turned off of the political process and the documented success of nonpartisan voter engagement campaigns abroad, we need to give Elections Canada more resources, not less. We could be having a conversation about bold strategies for increasing participation, possibly mandatory voting or online voting, or placing more polling stations in areas that target lower voting populations. Instead, this law forces Canadians to protect the democratic rights we already have. This bill is fundamental to our democracy. If the Conservative government is serious about improving our democratic process, why are they so afraid about talking about the act in their communities? Why not get people excited about it? Take the act to Canadians and see what people think. Canadians nationwide should be given the time and the opportunity to meaningfully participate in the creation of a new Elections Act that so fundamentally affects our democratic rights. Before turning it over to the opposition parties to make brief statements, I'm going to do an official handoff of the petition of 53,743 Canadians. So maybe we'll do a quick photo op, and then we can have the opposition parties make a quick statement.
Good work.
Great work. Great job.
Thank you all for being here. And now I'm going to have a brief statement from one member of each opposition party before opening the floor up for questions. So we'll start with Mr. Scott.
Thank you so much, Adam. Quite obviously, this is an amazing accomplishment in a short period of time. It's extraordinarily important that civil society reacts in the way it is. A number of organizations have taken leadership role in expressing a general outrage Canadians are feeling about the Unfair Elections Act. What I would like to say, I think Adam did an amazing job in summarizing the problems with this bill and the undermining animus of this bill for our democracy. What I would say, finally, is that the fundamental problem of Bill C-23, the Unfair Elections Act, is that the Conservatives have managed to turn ordinary Canadians into an imagined threat, an imaginary threat to our democracy. C-23 has turned the truth on its head. They've diverted attention from the fundamental problem of organized fraud, such as the In-N-Out scandal in 2006 and the fraudulent robocall scandal of fraud of 2011, and they've turned the lens back on ordinary Canadians. Le problème fondamental avec le projet de loi sur la réforme électorale, c'est que les conservateurs ont traité, ils traitent les Canadiens comme la menace pour la démocratie, au lieu d'un focus sur le fait que les partis politiques, les conservateurs, en fait, ont créé les menaces pour la démocratie en 2006, 2011, avec les efforts qui ont fait quelques conservateurs ou le système, l'apparatus conservateur. Donc, I end there by saying that last Thursday at a press conference with my colleague Dave Christofferson, I threw out a challenge to colleagues across the aisle. I named Michael Chong and Brad Trust as two examples of conservatives who are trying to create a little bit of impetus from the conservative side on changing some aspects of our democracy. I do not see how those two individuals and anybody else who has the same concerns on the conservative side cannot vote tonight for the opposition day motion to have the Procedure and House Affairs Committee travel across Canada to hear from Canadians about the concerns that Adam so ably outlined. Conservatives have to look themselves in the mirror. This motion tonight is about process. It's about going across Canada, and if they cannot manage to vote for this, boy, we know there's something fundamentally wrong on the other side of the aisle. Thank you very much. Scott, or Elizabeth?
The Liberal Party, sure.
First off, I want to thank Leadnow for inviting us, and Adam, thank you very much for the summation. I won't go into details. I think Adam did a very sufficient job. When this all started, the way it started was mysterious, to say the least. The consultations that they had done were of a very select few people. And what they've done is they've managed to manage an exercise in isolation. They want to achieve independence for Elections Canada. And what they've done is they've achieved isolation for an individual who needs more powers. The Minister Poilievre, wants to say that he is putting the referee back on the ice, when in fact what he's done, what he's endeavored to do, is he's put the referee on and he took his whistle from him. It's a referee that has no power, and now it's been separated from the base degrees which he came from. Because in Elections Canada right now, there are people fanning across this country to seek out what is wrong with our system and to make it better. And now you have a commissioner that finds himself in a different building with no powers. Even the powers that were asked specifically by that group, were totally ignored. The consultation process is one that is very short-sighted. They only wanted to hear from the people that fed into what they wanted to achieve, which was to move Elections Canada away from them. And to essentially, instead of making them neutral, they've now become neutered. So if you look at what they've done and what they talk about, for instance, a countrywide consultation is now considered a gong show. It's a circus. Now, when you consult with Canadians, when did you ever think that it was going to turn into a circus or a gong show? It's an exercise in democracy. The problem is that Mr. Poilievre only wants to hear from those who give him an A, and he wants to isolate those who give him an F, and not hear from them and marginalize them. And that's an unfortunate part of this whole process. Vouching. Why does the Conservative Party choose to throw out the system of vouching based on a few people who commit fraud? Again, what they're doing is they're appealing to the lowest common denominator, when in fact vouching does, by getting rid of it, disenfranchise a whole group of people: rural voters, First Nations, students, and many others. This system needs to be fixed. It doesn't need to be thrown out. But that is typical of what's happening here because, again, it is an exercise to isolate the enemies of the Conservative Party. Thank you very much.
Je vais ajouter seulement quelques mots parce que le temps presse. Mais c'est clair qu'on doit redonner la démocratie sa place au Canada. Et ce projet de loi C-23, c'est dans la mauvaise direction. It's clear, and I agree with everything my colleagues have said, that we do not have, and I've said it before, we don't have a crisis in Canada of Canadians voting more than once. We have a crisis in Canada of Canadians voting less than once. And this bill will make it more difficult for Canadians to vote. And despite the different forms of ID one can use, to listen to debates, particularly yesterday in the House, on the excellent motion from the NDP to take this bill and have public hearings. I heard Conservative spokespeople give the impression that you could vote if you were students, if you had your student ID card, or why couldn't you find your birth certificate? You could bring your birth certificate, your student ID card, your transcript, you still couldn't vote. This set of complicated ID requirements that were put in place under Stephen Harper are now worsened under this. I don't blame Pierre Poilievre. The responsibility for this bill rests in PMO. The solution to this bad bill rests in Canadians saying, no way will they accept changing our elections laws on a fast track with restricted debate. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'd like to open the floor for any questions.
And this is for anyone that wants to answer. What indicator